Please welcome today's Master of Ceremonies, Doug Shoup.
Welcome back, everyone, to day 2 of our second virtual summit. What an incredible lineup of breakout sessions we had yesterday and this morning. Thank you again to today's titanium sponsor, Jacobs. We would like to also thank this afternoon's exclusive closing session sponsor, HNTB. Thank you, HNTB, for making this program session possible. Just in case you are wondering, winners of the Easter eggs in the virtual expo will win some really fantastic prizes from our sponsors. Happy searching. Also, if you have found a golden ticket in your bento box, please know that you will be the recipient of 2 free Disneyland Park tickets and 2022 Summit and VIP registrations. There are 5 golden tickets to be found. And at the end of this closing session, I will draw the name for our grand prize. This year's grand prize is a $1,000 Hawaiian Airlines gift card. So please stay tuned until the very end. And now, for our final discussion, I would like to introduce a representative from our underwriting sponsor, Jacobs. Here to moderate our closing session is Judy Johnson, Vice President of Jacobs and Mobility 21 Advisory Board Member.
Wow, this is so great. I think all of you know I'm a people person. It means so much to have all of you with me today. But I have to be honest, I'm struggling a little bit here to get the interaction I think our audience was looking for. I'm just not 100% sure this is working. Don't get me wrong, I really appreciate you making the effort to be here, but I'm thinking we might need to try something else. But thank you, really, thank you so much. Well, this year's summit is just about a wrap. But before you take off to the virtual Tiki Bar, you're going to want to hear this discussion with Mobility 21's Executive Committee of the Board. Joining us today is OCTA Chief Executive Officer Daryl Johnson, RCTC Executive Director Ann Mayer, Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce President Maria Salinas, and SBCTA Executive Director Dr. Ray Wolf. None are strangers to us, but all are leading voices in the region for transportation and business. So welcome, panel members. Let's jump in and talk about infrastructure and what the outlook looks like for 2022. So Daryl, Ann, and Ray, it's been quite a year. With still so many unknowns ahead of us, let's start the discussion off with projects. We all know the problems we experienced during the shutdowns, but what did you see in terms of positives that resulted from limited mobility?
Happy to be on this panel with my colleagues, and Judy, thank you for moderating the panel for us. Well, I think the first priority we all had was to make sure our projects and our programs continued. And I think collectively, our region did a great job of making sure we continue to put projects out on the street. We continue to make sure the industry was working. We kept the money flowing, kept the jobs going. I think we did a really good job of making sure that we kept that progress moving, and that's really, really important. And I think the fact that we have such a pipeline of projects here in the Mobility 21 region really helped to make sure we kept those going.
On that same note, if I could, Judy, also thanks for having us here. This is fun and exciting. There's so many negatives that we could talk about over the last year and a half, but on the project side, there's actually a few positives. Less traffic for us in Orange County. We had 3 big projects. Our I-405 improvement project. We were able to get an additional 10,000 hours of lane closures approved with working with ourselves and Caltrans. We could work longer at night, longer on the weekends, and that just makes the project go faster and better. We finished a project on the I-5 about 3 months ahead of schedule and under budget. And just recently, because of this really strange economic environment, the interest rates on the 30-year T-bills are really, really, really low. And we were able to do the first ever reset of a TIFIA loan on our 405 project. And the savings on that is $158 million in interest. And I get a lot of questions, what are you gonna do with all the money? it's easy. We're going to reinvest it in more infrastructure here in Orange County. So faster work, projects done sooner, under budget, saved money. So a lot of negatives, but also when you look for them, there's positives in there for sure.
So Judy, just quickly, I agree with everything that both Ann and Daryl spoke to, but I think the other thing that was really interesting, we learned a lot as agencies. We learned that we weren't constrained by the old paradigms. We didn't all have to converge in an office space in order to deliver the work, right? It took a little bit of time for all of us, I think, to collectively figure out how to operate in the virtual environment. But we learned that space is a space where we could operate and operate successfully and continue to deliver and meet the expectations of the taxpayers in our respective counties. The other thing that I think is key in there in that lesson is, part of our job is to create mobility and reduce congestion, right? And if our staff are not all converging on the office space on a daily basis, we're accomplishing that in part. And so I think there were some lessons learned in this that we might not have otherwise challenged ourselves to experience.
Can I just throw something else out there? I think we need to give a real big shout out to our contractor partners who kept their crews out there working and in really difficult circumstances. Although traffic was less, speeds on the corridors were really, really high. So the safety concerns were really significant. So I just want to make sure I gave a shout out to our contractor crews who kept all of this work moving out in the field.
It's an excellent point, Ann.
Yeah, great point. I would add Caltrans to that as well, and on the highway jobs, because they continued to process everything they needed to process to make sure we could continue to execute the work, not only on schedule, but faster than normal. So good point.
That's great. Well, you can all bet for sure that I'm not going to delete the pictures that I have on my phone of Wilshire Boulevard in the heart of Beverly Hills being entirely shut down for the construction of Metro's Purple Line. I'm keeping those. So let's move on to the Delta variant. It has thrown an unanticipated wrinkle in our recovery progress. How are you all dealing with it? And what does the future of work look like? Is everybody going back to the office? Is there going to be a hybrid of home and office?
I'll go. I think Ray said it a moment ago, Judy, I think we've learned how to work remotely. I think we always wanted to operate in a safety first environment, but we also wanted to be flexible and sort of follow that public health guidance. And we've been successful for sure. But at the same time, nothing beats in-person collaboration. So from our perspective, we sort of have this idea that we're gradually returning employees to work. We want to have people sort of engage as appropriate 1, 2, maybe 3 days a week in some type of collaborative manner. Some of that is 2-dimensional, some of it is 3-dimensional, but we want to be able to sort of still engage, because for our organization, we're small enough to sort of know everyone, but big enough to still take on big projects. But we need to have that collaboration. So we have people working on a hybrid schedule now. I anticipate as we move through the month of October and November, we will get more people in, more days per week. And then my goal is by the time we roll to mid-January, we introduce a full return to work program, but with a lot more permanency around remote working, flexible scheduling, because we can't look back to 2020 and 2019. We need to look forward to 2022 and beyond in terms of how we engage the workforce, how we attract and retain, and what those expectations are. So I think we've learned a lot, back to Ray's earlier point, and how we adapt and adjust. And I'm sure the private sector, I can't wait to hear what Maria has to say about this, but I think there's a lot going on in the private sector as well.
Yeah, I definitely, to jump in on this one, first of all, thank you for having me and to join our transportation leaders here. Certainly the experience in the workforce is exactly what, in the private sector, exactly what you described, Daryl. I think that we have definitely been through a period where we kind of moved quickly into a remote environment. And everybody was thinking, well, it's just a matter of time, weeks, before we get back into the office. And the conversation that businesses are having today is, what is that purpose of that office in the future? How will we engage with not only our work, but our workplace and our workforce? And when you think about the future of work, it's today, it's happening today. And I think that now is a time where businesses are really evaluating all those different options. And I think when we talk about our workforce, we have to understand that they're reassessing their own way of thinking about work and how they want to engage with their jobs, their employers, and just employment in general. So we're definitely seeing a rethinking, a reimagining of work, what work will look like in the future.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, we all had such high hopes and plans for how we were going to roll back in this summer and lots of optimism. I think for us, what we've really learned is we need to be adaptable. We need to be flexible. We need to be able to pivot. And we need to be able to make decisions based on what's happening around us. And I think that's really challenging in a workplace to have that kind of, turmoil, I'll call it, because there's a lot of uncertainty there. But I think folks are responding pretty positively. We're really pleased to hear that some of our consultants and private sector partners have been able to reduce their overhead, downsize on some of their office space so that their businesses can continue to do well with a reduced overhead. So we're trying to be supportive there. But as public agencies, there's a lot we have to do in the office. We have to provide services to the public. So we're going to try and remain as flexible as we can, approach it with a bit of a sense of humor, if that's possible, because the best, we've had some terrific plans and then at the last minute had to change. So we're trying to make sure we make the right decisions at the right time and bring folks in. But I agree with the collaboration. And I have to admit, I miss seeing some of these faces here on the screen today. And I can't wait for us to be able to be together and have these kinds of conversations.
Yeah.
So I'll just briefly add, we've actually been fully open since early May. And so we've had some challenges that we've had to experience, but things have gone well. And, we definitely took the lessons learned that we could actually operate our organization virtually. And we basically, we're in a hybrid situation now. I've got some people that are in 2 days a week and others that don't come in at all because they have children that they need to attend to. And since society hasn't fully opened up, or they have aging parents that they need to attend to. So, we're finding ways to work through this. And I want to, give a big shout out to my team because my staff have shown through all of this craziness that we've dealt with over this last year and a half, that they can continue to be very productive. And that's really what's led us to the situation we're in now, where we've shown a hybrid environment will work. We were forced to show it, and it has worked. So.
And just if I could just add one other thing, because all of you are speaking about just, everyday issues that everyone is feeling. I think this next decade here is going to be about how we handle our human resource infrastructure in organizations, right? How are we working with our employees? What kind of tools are we giving them so that they could be mobile? How are we rewarding them and building a culture in an environment that may be hybrid and part virtual? So many issues and questions that will arise. And I think, one of you mentioned, flexibility and openness. I think it's going to be something that leaders of organizations are going to have open mind about what is the future hold for their workforce.
I think Maria brings up a really important point, to the degree that those of us in the public transportation space, whether that's streets, roads, highways, transit, if we can understand how business is thinking about their workforce, then we can understand, as we're planning that transportation system, should we be planning differently in the long term? Do we have structural changes? Do we have temporary changes? And it just strikes me as how valuable this partnership of Mobility 21 is, where we can sit around a table, real or virtual, and hear from business leaders like Maria and others about how they're thinking about that next decade or two, and then how we can sort of incorporate that into our transportation planning processes. So real value here in the Mobility 21 coalition.
I agree. And as I've been driving back and forth to work and seeing how much traffic is on the road, there are a lot of people who are still going into the office, and that feedback from our private sector partners about what their employees need is really, really important. SBCTA and RCTC jointly manage a rideshare program. We've had to pivot in the kinds of services we provide. So we've got to throw out kind of the old way we thought about a rideshare program and start thinking about how do we provide support to the business owners and business leaders so that their employees have the mobility that they need. So we really have had to change how we think about it. That's, there's no doubt about that. And it might take a little time to figure out what those business owners need.
Right.
So again, partnership is really important here.
And I'll just add that our company in the last year reduced our real estate footprint in many of the offices that we occupy and are moving to a hybrid that I don't think we internally yet know, what it will look like at the end. So this conversation is important. We'll get back to this topic a little bit down the road here. But I want to go back to, Daryl, Ann, and Ray. How do you think business decisions on the home versus the office, and we kind of just touched on this, how will it impact your approach to program and project development?
For me, I think that the simplest thing to say, which is the hardest thing to figure out, is what is a temporary change and what is a structural change. So we learned things, for example, after the Great Recession about how people, where they lived, where they worked, how their jobs were. But I think it collectively took us a bit of time to sort of incorporate that thinking of that big crisis into our planning process. So my sense is we still have to figure that out. I think we're going to see different traffic patterns emerge. 7:30 a.m. and 5:30 p.m. are probably not what we're going to see forever in the future in terms of those peaks. We're going to see different weekends, midday, and I think our job is to figure out how to accommodate that, whether it's roadway, whether it's public transit, or in the case of Ann and I, how we jointly manage the 91 Express Lanes corridor in terms of, we're already seeing different traffic patterns emerge there, which is driving different pricing decisions through that corridor. So I think we're going to see, again, what's temporary and what's long-term and structural, I think is the key question for us.
Great. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. Daryl and Maria. So just a year ago, the state was worried about a deficit, and now there's a surplus of $75 billion with a lot of people laying claim to that money. What kind of economic recovery do you see as the most impactful with the state having this much of a surplus?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that one because it has not been lost on us that the state has been in a surplus situation. And with so many businesses that have been struggling, especially the small businesses, and when you hear folks on this call talk about their contractors and their vendors, we really saw this as an opportunity for the state to, one, not only provide economic relief through grants and some of the loan programs that were made available, but to also invest in small businesses through technical assistance support. And let me tell you why that's important. Because there are many small businesses that experienced this pandemic and didn't have a safety net. And they were scrambling to figure out, how to navigate a pandemic, how to stay afloat. And we saw that not only at the LA Chamber, but many other business organizations that stepped forward in providing assistance, from basics as how do you fill out some of these grant applications that were, could have been a little complex. How do you fill out PPP? How do you have a digital presence? How do you navigate the systems that all go online all of a sudden? So those investments that the state put into technical assistance were one of the things that we thought was probably one of the best ideas that came out of the economic recovery. The other thing that the state of California did that I thought really helped our small business community is they passed a legislation, AB 80, which is a conformity of the PPP revenues that companies received, those that received the PPP loan, to ensure that they were handled in the same manner at the state as they were in federal, meaning that they were non-taxable revenues to the small businesses. That was a big win for many small businesses that received that PPP loan that were possibly facing a tax burden because they had taken economic recovery dollars. So we saw the state invest in some of those areas from a technical assistance, from the grant program, without a doubt, that helped many of the small businesses that had contracts with organizations like the ones that are led by my colleagues here.
I think thanks, Maria, for covering the broad base of business things. I'll bring it sort of more narrow to transportation because that's what I get to do. But we know $75 billion is a huge number. And although I'm sure at least 3 of the 4 of us on the call would say it should all go to transportation, we know that's not the reality, right? There's a whole host of needs in our state. And there was a lot of effort made over the summer and into the late summer to try to sort of sort that out. I think we all know the legislature couldn't come to specific details, but may revert to the general fund. Hopeful some of that goes to transportation. But let me focus on some of the good things that I think did come out of that. We saw some notable transportation investments in the budget, around $2.3 billion for zero emission infrastructure, for zero emission transit buses. There was a large number, charging and refueling infrastructure. These are all things that are sort of hard to get to, and sort of having that supplemental funding is going to be important. And I know I'm speaking as with the transit operator hat on for just a moment. Find a zero emission bus is twice as much as a regular bus. And how do we get to that extra space? And this investment is really going to help us sort of meet those zero emission goals laid out by the state. I think the other thing that I'm excited about is the $600 million or so in the regional early action planning grants, which is going to help implement 375, SB 375. We know that has been in statute for quite some time, but we also know it's expensive to implement, and having that is going to be really helpful. The SCAG region, about $240 million we expect to be allocated for that, and that's helpful as well. Maybe I'll just end quick on just a quick less than positive note. I won't call it negative because all investment in transportation is positive, but in a post SB1 era, this idea that we have a lot more competitive grants, while it sounds good to pick the best project, it doesn't give you sort of certainty in your planning process, because you're looking for that competitive space. You can't plan long term. And while I think it was well intentioned, I think from my perspective and probably other regional transportation commissions, formula funds give you a little bit better knowledge of where you're going in the future, and then you can plan longer and make smarter decisions on your investments. So that's kind of my thinking on the surplus and how we should be handling and what we're excited about, and look forward to more discussion on it.
Great. So I'm going to switch gears again. So Ray, Daryl, and Ann, last year this panel very powerfully focused on equity and recovery. Can you talk a little bit about what's happened in that space in your organizations, and where do we go from here as the equity and recovery conversation continues?
I'll go ahead and get started there. I mean, certainly those issues both together and separately remain really at the forefront for RCTC. We have embedded those conversations in our legislative platforms, across our objectives for the whole agency. We're really focusing on our lower income, disadvantaged communities, communities of color, and communities that have traditionally been impacted by transportation improvement projects. So we're dealing with this at multiple levels of, the big picture policy issues where we talk about what does the future look like? How do we ensure access for all communities? How do we make sure we try to bring more jobs to our community to help create more employment closer to home? But we're also, Maria talked about getting back to the basics. We're also looking at things at a very basic level of how do we ensure that we're listening to communities? How are we making sure that we give them the opportunity to be heard? Simple things like, when do we schedule our public meetings? When do we go out to neighborhood meetings? How do we make sure people who don't normally have access to a public meeting, and virtual is a great opportunity to be able to have more access. So we're looking at the basics of how do we make sure that we have opportunity to hear the people in our community who can be most impacted. We've also created a community engagement manager position so that we can start reaching out more to not only some of our local communities, but Riverside County has a great number of tribes. And so we're doing some, going to be focusing on some tribal outreach as well. So I think last year we really jump-started the conversation amongst all of our organizations that this needs to be an important conversation that we have, not just one time and not just, not just a couple of times a year, but it's got to be, these policies have to be embedded in our organizations from a policy standpoint as well as practice.
Judy, I think it's a great question. I think last year's discussion of this at Mobility 21 was not only important, but it was powerful. And this idea that we can't just talk about it once and walk away and not come back to it, or come back once a year and just sort of check in. As Ann said, it has to be embedded. And I think navigating through the pandemic, from my perspective at OCTA, it showed how vital public transit was to people that needed it in the worst possible time. If you were riding a public transit bus in April of 2020, you had no other choice. And we needed to be there for people that needed that. And through that sort of lens, we've done a number of very specific things. We've had all of our employees internally go through unconscious bias training. Obviously, we had to do it remotely over the last year and a half, but I think it was important. We've launched 2 internal task forces on diversity, equity, and inclusion. One is really about the internal practices that Ann talked about. How do we embed this into our internal practices? And then the other one is, how do we focus on the agency as a whole, and how do we look externally? And when you start looking at what you can do externally, other things come to mind. We had been working with our community colleges to make sure that all community college students could ride our bus system for free. And that made sense in the sense that we wanted to have transportation not be a barrier to education. But we took it one step further in late summer of this year, and we put that into 16 to 18 years old as well. So for 6 months, it's a pilot program. Any youth in Orange County can ride the OC bus system at no charge between the ages of 6 and 18. And we hope that we can expand that. We've hired a consultant to look at sort of our overall practices and do gap analysis. We're doing a lot of work in this area. But one thing I'll just close with is, we've had for the last 8 years a diverse community leaders group, diverse communities in Orange County, faith-based, all kinds of different sort of backgrounds and participation. And unfortunately, in 2020, one of our public board members passed away while in office. And the board recently selected a member to replace him from our diverse community leaders group, who had been serving in that group for the last 8 years, had been engaged in the community here in Orange County, and is now a member of our board. So I'm proud of what we've done at the staff level, but I'm really proud of what the board, the decision they made earlier this year as well.
Our County Board of Supervisors actually took action to declare racism as a health crisis in San Bernardino County, which really set the stage. We followed that action by creating our own internal ad hoc of board members to really look internally at our organization, how we procure projects, the size of projects, and how that impacts the bidding pool, how insurance limitations create challenges. We're able to look at it not only through the lens of a transportation agency, but also, since we act as the Council of Governments for the county, to look at a more broad perspective of what are the things that we as a Council of Governments are advancing in a regional perspective that we should be doing to ensure that equity and disadvantaged communities have a voice in the conversation in our county. So a lot of things have changed for the better, certainly here in San Bernardino County. And it's exciting. It's a new time. It's a new way of thinking. Anne really, I think, nailed it when she was talking about how do we engage the communities that are affected by the projects that we're working on, whether it's in transportation space or it's in the council space. We need to do a better job of that. And that's a challenge today. You can't just put an ad in the newspaper and expect somebody's going to read it, right? And so trying to figure out the best platform or the best suite of platforms to engage the community at the broadest extent possible is something that we're really focused on as well.
Yeah, Judy, if I could just jump in on this one too, just from a private sector perspective, because I think Anne mentioned, a new role that she has in her organization, and Ray talked about, the internal reviews, and Daryl has mentioned that as well. I mean, that's what's going on in the private sector, that when we talk about equity, it's not just words. How do you put that into action? How do you look at your employment practices and saying, what kind of barriers are we creating for people? I was so excited to hear you talk about procurement. That is something that for some, business owners is unreachable in large organizations. But how do you look at your procurement practices to make sure there aren't barriers there that favor one versus other? So definitely those are actionable items, and good examples for other organizations that maybe haven't tackled deep into the how-tos within their organization.
So I do have to say that I'm glad of the platform that our company put in together for justice and equity last year, and the funding that we put behind it. It really added to, really putting action behind our words. So this is such an important subject, and I'm glad to hear the action that's going behind all of the conversation that had begun last year. So I'm going to go back to state and federal funding for just a moment. So we heard a panel speak this morning about state and federal funding efforts for infrastructure. Can Southern California expect a boon? Are there overarching processes that are changing? And how will all of this affect how the private sector does business with our public sector partners?
I don't know that I ever expect anything. It's better not to have any expectations, but what I think we can be is optimistic. I think we can be optimistic that our federal partners are having the conversations that need to be had to make sure that we can get more money here in Southern California, because our federal partnerships are really, really important. When I look back at the key RCTC projects over the past decade, it's been our Paris Valley Line project that was a small start, our I-15 express lanes, our 91 express lanes. We had 2 TIFIA loans for those projects. We could not have done that without federal partnership, not to mention the federal formula dollars. So I'm optimistic, but we need to stay in this conversation, both individually and collectively, and especially under the Mobility 21 umbrella, because Southern California is very much impacted by the goods movement industry. It's an important part of our economy, but we can't bear the burden of the mitigation on our own. And I think we really need to stay engaged at the federal level to make sure that California's voice is heard, whether we're talking about funding or policy. We've got to make sure we stay at the table and turn that optimism maybe into some cash. Be a great goal.
I agree with Ann. I don't know if we should expect anything, although, obviously with a bill of that size passing through the Senate, making its way through the House, there is likely to be some outcome that could be good for transportation. I think it sort of does 2 things that are important. One is, obviously, it significantly increases the funding level. That's maybe a given. What it doesn't do, though, of course, is fix the long-term structural issues with the Highway Trust Fund. So it's important that we get the dollars and make the investment, but it's also important that we have a good fix, and we're not quite there yet. And the other one is, it does give us some long-term policy certainty, because I think money and policy need to go together. As an example, there's some really encouraging ideas from our perspective in project delivery, things like the one federal decision policy that can streamline some of the project delivery around environmental pieces. So those are really important. But I'll go back to one of the things I said earlier, Judy, is formula is really important versus discretionary. And California with our population and our size, we're going to need so much investment, and we're going to do much, much better if the funding is set in formula-based programs. And what we see right now is that most of it is directed at discretionary grant programs, which is good from an outcomes perspective, but I think it really makes it much, much harder for California to get its fair share. And again, the importance of this group, this coalition, and all of our transportation partners that are hopefully watching us today, we can all work together to make sure that not only we're getting our fair share, we're getting the right share at the right time for the right projects in Southern California.
I can jump in with just a comment here. I think that, you know, for us at the chamber and the other business partners or your private sector partners, this is definitely where we should be working together and collaborating and leaning in with such significant, you know, bills, legislation at the federal level. You know, California does stand to be the biggest recipient. So what that looks like, and you know, those attributes that you mentioned, Daryl, I think that is where a Mobility 21 coalition, where you have partners from your private sector that can really help support and advocate on your behalf. Just wanted to make sure that, I know we all know that, but we've taken a close look at that, the infrastructure bills at the federal level, and definitely know that there could be great opportunity for California.
I think that's critical, Maria. We can't take it for granted. You know, we know we have huge population, a big state, lots of needs, and it's better for us, in my opinion, to have sort of a fight, if you will, between North and South, Central California, Southern California, than fighting with some other state about that. We really need to put all of our effort into making sure there's good investment and appropriate investment in California.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the estimates that I've seen is California would be the biggest recipient. So, you know, working together will be important.
So that's actually a good segue to our next question for Ann, Daryl, and Ray. Is the partnership between the state and local and regional transportation agencies strong? Where are the gaps in funding and maybe even attention at the state level?
So if you don't mind, I'll jump in first on this one. I think certainly at the local level, here in the Inland Empire, the partnership with Caltrans District 8 is very strong and has been for a number of years. Our partnership at SBCTA with the California State Transportation Agency is very strong. We're doing a lot of things in collaboration, in particular, piloting the first zero emission passenger rail vehicle, which will be here in San Bernardino County in about 2 years. So that's really exciting. And I think we all share a common bond with the California Transportation Commission. They're partners as we forge ahead in trying to increase mobility throughout Southern California, and talked about the impacts of freight. We also in the Inland Empire suffer from the migration of the population looking for affordable housing. And I don't know that affordable is the right word, but housing that they can afford and the quality of life that they can afford, which they can't find in many of the coastal counties here in Southern California today. And yet there's a huge imbalance between jobs and housing, which is driving the commuter demand higher. And so one of the challenges that creates when the state is focused on reducing vehicle miles traveled, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, is that it doesn't work on the ground in certain areas because of pressures that are not necessarily created by inland counties. And so, you know, we have been arguing that there needs to be strategic investment in our highway network. We're doing a lot in the Inland Empire right now to advance transportation alternatives and make them workable, make, you know, the transition between one system, one mode seamless to another. But at the same time, there's growing demand for other reasons that are out of our control that we need to address, and addressing it is going to require strategic investment in the highway capacity. And that's something that at the state level, you know, they're not focused on right now. And so there's always challenges in this type of an arena, and we'll work through them.
I piggyback a little bit there on Ray's excellent comments, in that one size does not fit all. And what may work in the Inland Empire may not work in Orange County or Los Angeles or the Bay Area or Fresno. So we have to be really cognizant of that fact. And that's something that we're going to keep pushing in our conversations at the state level. We can find a lot of common ground here related to the policy decisions, but what really makes a difference is how these policies are implemented. And, you know, Ray and I grew up at Caltrans. Wait, no, I grew up at Caltrans. Ray, maybe not quite yet. But that's where, you know, we spent many, many years of our career there. And Ray, I hope it's okay, I'm speaking for you. We're former district directors. I think it's fair to say that we have great respect for the work that our state partners do. It was, you know, it's a really important, there's a very important role for the state to play, but there's also a really important role for regional transportation planning agencies, our metropolitan planning organizations. Self-help counties bring billions of dollars to the table every single year. And I think what we need to look at is how do we work together to make sure that as policies are being implemented, or, you know, whether we're talking about greenhouse gas reduction, whether we're talking about reducing vehicle miles traveled, it has to make sense for the community in which the policies are being implemented. And it's got to be done in partnership. And without that partnership, it's going to be difficult for any of us to succeed.
You know, Judy, I did not grow up at Caltrans, but I still have great respect for district directors, including here in Orange County, and the work that the department does. But I also think that while we have a lot of conversations about should we invest in highways or not, should we put all of our dollars in transit, this idea that not only one size fits all, but this idea is one solution is not the magic bullet. We have to attack the transportation problem from multiple fronts. And you know, as a transit operator here in Orange County, we run the bus system, of course, the paratransit system. We're building a light rail streetcar system, and we're getting a lot of investment in a lot of the different modes. But one of the things that I think we need to think about more is a lot of the state policies are focused on capital. So we can get investment in transit, we can get investment in commuter rail, we can get investment in zero emission buses. We have to pay to operate these, and that operating cost is very high. And many of the ways that we're doing that now is through sort of one-time programs or adjusting fare box recovery ratios, or used in the last 18 months using COVID relief dollars, which super helpful, of course, on those fronts. But I think we need to sort of align this idea of the capital investment side, the operating cost side, and this understanding that we can't stop maintaining what we have. We can't stop investing in the roadway system, whether it's the local street and road network, whether it's the highway network, and only invest in the transit network. They all have to work together. It's a system, and you have to make sure that that system works together. But overall, we couldn't do the work that we do without the partnership within the state. On the highway side, the transit and intercity rail capital side, the commuter rail side. So I think it's strong. But I also think if we roll up our sleeves, we can make it stronger, and we can figure out how we can do better for each individual community that we're trying to work within.
So I heard a little bit of discussion here about the intersection of housing and transportation. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit more. Maria and Ann, and maybe Daryl and Ray, talk a little bit about that intersection and about transit-oriented development communities in your counties. Okay,
I'll jump first on this conversation, and it's really, really important. With the latest census data that came out, the number of people moving into the Inland Empire, moving into Riverside County specifically, is very, very significant. We've got significant population growth. Daryl and I say this in a lot of different places, but people are driving until they qualify. People are having to drive further and further away from their place of employment so they can afford a home. When our neighboring counties have median home prices that are almost double the prices out here in the Inland Empire, it's obvious motivation for people to continue to move out in this direction. We've got to have the transportation infrastructure to serve those folks. And while we have a lot of people who have, I say it's the luxury of being able to have a remote working opportunity, we have so many people for whom that is not an option at all. We've got to make sure that we have simultaneous conversations about affordable housing just across the board, but also transportation solutions and transit-oriented developments in certain locations in more urbanized or suburban areas where there is rail and bus service makes an awful lot of sense. But we're still trying to make sure that we're able to provide basic essential transportation services to people who need to be able to get from home to their job.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt that, we have a housing shortage crisis, that this is definitely not just an LA regional, issue here. It's definitely something that is a statewide concern. But I think Ann is right. I think all those issues that she talked about are things that are experiences in the private sector. But let's just even step back even further. It's a quality of life issue. If we can't have housing that is near to, places of work, if we can't have the options, the transit options, then it really does create a personal crisis for families to make decisions in terms of, where they want to work, where they want to live. So definitely agree with Ann that, transit hubs, the housing and transit hubs is definitely something that's very important to look at.
Thank you, Maria. So we're going to wrap up with just a quick question for each of you to answer. We're looking at full recovery, hopefully at some point. What will that look like for you?
Gosh, that's a loaded question, Judy, but maybe I'll jump in on it. It's looked so differently over the last year. At one point we thought our Measure M sales tax was going to be down 30%. Turned out that it went up 9%. But bus ridership is only 60% of where it was at. Rail ridership, we've made big investments in Metrolink. We think it's a great thing to invest in. It is way, way down. So I think this idea that I talked about early on is what is temporary and what is structural. And when we can figure that out, then I think we can say we've, quote, recovered. But in the middle of that, I think we need to look at, again, what is that long range look at? What is that we can do now? So we're going to do everything we can to build back ridership. We're going to continue to invest in the projects that we made and promises that we made. But at the same time, we're looking to all of our partners, whether it's the private sector with Maria or here in Orange County, the Orange County Business Council, all of Mobility 21, SCAG, the state, our partners in the Inland Empire, about how does this modified normal look? Because it's not a new normal, it's not the old normal, but it's modified in some sense. And I think we have to be positioned to adjust. Last thing in closing, sales tax, I think for us is all an indicator of economic activity, but people are spending money on different things. And I think we should keep a real close eye on where those dollars are being spent. Not the total top line number, but those subcategories. And that's going to give us a real sense of activity, economic activity in our respective areas.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here. What is full recovery? When will we know we're in full recovery? I think for me, I think of recovery meaning like, when will we get back to where we were? And I think all of us know that that's not what's going to happen, that it's going to look different and be different. And I think that there's still so much uncertainty around what will that look like. Even a couple of months ago, I think when we thought we were going to reopen, we were marching down a certain path, and then with this the Delta variant, definitely got pulled back. So I struggle to think about what is that definition of full recovery. I just feel like it's about being open to a different way of doing things in the future.
So Judy, I would agree with both what Maria and Daryl just spoke to. We're not going to know. And it's not really recovery as much as what's the new reality that we face. Yeah. And I would argue that we won't know until some point in the future when we look back and say, okay, that was the defining moment as we were coming out of this pandemic. The reality is an organization like Mobility 21 is going to help us to succeed in whatever that new reality becomes and whatever it looks like. I think that's the strength of an organization like ours with the business partners and the agency partners working hand in hand across county lines to make sure that we are successful in delivering mobility solutions to keep Southern California economically viable.
Yeah, I think these are all great points, whether we're talking about reality or recovery or normal. I guess I'll know it when I see it, maybe. But in the meantime, I think it's the partnership, and my colleagues here have already expressed that. It's the partnership. It's continuing to be innovative and creative, looking towards the future, but also making sure we're not leaving anybody behind. We need to make sure that we identify where the gaps are, look to see where people are having the most difficult time getting back to baseline, get a more difficult time getting back to a more normal state of quality of life. Can't leave folks behind. So I think, there's a lot of reason for optimism. And I think Mobility 21 can have a really important role in helping Southern California succeed.
Thank you. We all need to keep the dialogue going with our Mobility 21 public sector partners, our federal and state representatives, business champions like the Chamber, and our trade associations to stay on this very important road to recovery. We truly are in this together. So thank you again, panel. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you to our Mobility 21 officers, Daryl Johnson and Mayor Maria Salinas and Dr. Ray Wolf. And thank you to moderator Judy Johnson for your thoughtful discussion as we make our way towards recovery for Southern California. After this session, please note that the Expo Hall and Hospitality Suite will be open until noon. Networking in the Hospitality Suite with all conference attendees and small FaceTime with our regional executives will continue until noon today. So please head there after this raffle to enjoy your networking benefit.
And now for the Summit Raffle. We will have one grand prize winner. We have randomly selected one Summit registrant, and the attendee number is 890. Mark Von Leffern, Hill International. You are the lucky winner of a $1,000 Hawaiian Airlines gift card. We hope you enjoy your trip to Hawaii. Lastly, we would like to thank all of our Easter egg sponsors. Thank you for your generosity.
What a wonderful 2 days at Mobility 21. It was so great to see each and every one of you and enjoy our virtual Disney Aulani Resort. I'd like to thank all of our sponsors for their tremendous support. Thank you to our elected leaders for championing transportation. Thank you to the Mobility 21 Board of Directors and the planning team for hosting another incredible virtual summit. This was once again a unique setting for unprecedented times we are living in. And we are fortunate you participated and had the opportunity to reconnect and to learn. And to all of our members, you are the reason why our coalition is so strong, cohesive, and a force to be reckoned with. Thank you, and see you in the Expo Hall and Hospitality Suite for our final networking and FaceTime.